Mr Acting Deputy President, I just want to make sure I've got the wording right, but I move to disallow the regulations set out in the motion. If you can bear with me, if I could get some guidance from you, and perhaps Mr Acting Deputy President, perhaps I could get some guidance from you, and in turn from the clerk, deputy clerk, in relation to that. I think all I need to do at this stage is to move to disallow the regulations referred to in my notice of motion.
Senator Xenophon, if you move the motion, you can speak to it.
Yes, I now move the motion.
Okay, Senator Xenophon.
Thank you. Mr Acting Deputy President, the aim of this motion is to disallow the Civil Aviation Order 48.1 regulatory instrument, which outlines provisions in relation to fatigue management in the aviation industry. At the outset, I want to thank the Australian and International Pilots Association for their assistance in these matters. I also want to acknowledge representatives of CASA, including the Director of Aviation Safety, who spent time discussing the regulations with me, although they were not able to address my concerns. These regulations are in some areas a significant improvement over the existing framework. I want to make it very clear, however, that in other areas they are incredibly far behind the level Australia should be aiming for as an aviation world leader, and are, quite frankly, potentially unsafe. There is an argument that the regulation should not be disallowed because of these improvements, but my concern is that it has taken many years for these regulations to be updated. And in my view, it's unlikely they will be refined or improved in the near future. That's why this disallowance motion is so important, because it would force the relevant parties to go back to the table to come up with a much better outcome. It is far more likely that these regulations will be the ones we'll have to live with for years to come. So near enough must not be considered good enough, simply because CASA is under pressure to produce the new long-delayed rules. Part 48 of the Civil Aviation Orders was introduced in the 1950s and was based mostly on empirical evidence from World War II and the expansion of commercial aviation, rather than any scientific knowledge or evidence. It remained largely unaltered until the 1990s, when standard industry exemptions were introduced in response to commercial demands. These exemptions were not based on available scientific evidence, and instead were aimed at allowing airlines to maximise profits regardless of the safety of their crews or passengers. In relation to that, Mr Acting Deputy President, you well know you sat on an inquiry into aviation safety several years ago, and there was a leaked email from a Jetstar pilot that was head of the base, or who had responsibility for the Perth base of Jetstar, where some of his colleagues, some of the pilots, complained about fatigue, and the email was famously headed "Toughen up, princesses." That is a real concern, and I know that Senator Heffernan, who was the chair of that committee, or the deputy chair for Rural Affairs and Regional Affairs and Transport, was there that day when that evidence was given. The new rules in this instrument still retain that commercial bias. They allow operators to use fatigue risk management systems to exceed duty limits in a way that may be unsafe and not subject to any independent scrutiny. The International Civil Aviation Organisation, or ICAO, has set out requirements for fatigue management that explicitly state regulations should be based on scientific principles and knowledge. Instead, CASA has based many of their regulations on so-called operational experience, a tainted concept that can mean little more than what the operators are already doing. I believe, if you could put it in these terms, it's a regulatory version of "because I said so." We already have seen in previous Senate inquiries that operators, including Jetstar, Pell Air and Avtex's Skymaster, are not even meeting the poor requirements we have now. Worse, CASA does not always enforce those regulations. Its special audit of Pell Air's FRMS, their fatigue risk management system, revealed in the Senate inquiry into aviation accident investigations, which I note that Senator Fawcett, who's in the chamber, played a critical and very constructive role in. The CASA stated in that inquiry, it was stated previous CASA oversight did not provide sufficient evidence to confirm that Pell Air FRMS had ever been managing fatigue risk to a necessary standard. So that was what CASA said in its special audit of Pell Air's FRMS. Another example of CASA's, I say, lax attitude to fatigue can be seen in the Senate's earlier inquiry into pilot training and airline safety. Responding to a question on notice regarding significant duty extensions for Jetstar crew in 2011, CASA responded, and I quote, "CASA does not consider that these extensions require continual monitoring. The duty extensions recorded in January 2011 by Jetstar were a result of flight crew agreeing to operate beyond the standard 12-hour initial limits as provided for within Civil Aviation Order 48 exemption. No breaches of the 14-hour condition were recorded." Yet, Mr Acting Deputy President, crews had to extend beyond the maximum normal limit due to inadequate planning by Jetstar, which CASA, I believe, chose to ignore. Again, CASA's position is that the duty extensions are safe because they said so. There are now some new controls and extensions, but there are other permissible delays to extending a flight that may well render the changes redundant, ineffective in a sense. This is simply not good enough. Australia should be aiming to set a world standard in aviation, not to put in place the bare minimum to scrape by. A common response to discussions about fatigue is that pilots are the only ones who can decide if they are too fatigued to fly. Even Mr John McCormack, the Director of Aviation Safety at CASA, subscribes to this view, apparently, stating on ABC's Four Corners in relation to the Pell Air incident, and I quote, "In the end, it's only the pilot who can decide whether he is fatigued or he or she is fatigued and unable to conduct a flight." Unfortunately, Mr Acting Deputy President, this view, while common, ignores both scientific studies of fatigue and common sense. It is also extremely concerning that CASA's Director of Aviation Safety states this because apparently he believes it to be true. Firstly, the Director of CASA should know asking someone to describe their fatigue levels is a bit like asking someone how drunk they are. Because fatigue impairs our ability to reason and make accurate judgments, you can't ask someone who is fatigued to make a reasoned and accurate judgment about their own fatigue levels. Like the drunk who's convinced he's fine to drive, someone who's fatigued may feel fine or think they're functioning well enough to fulfil their tasks, until circumstances prove them wrong. It's not that they are irresponsible for taking risks, but simply that their ability to make the decision has been compromised. Secondly, this argument ignores the broader context in which pilots operate. They may be under pressure from their employer to work, or their workplace might have a culture of pushing through sickness or fatigue. Their hours may be uncertain and they may want to take work whenever it's available. Mr Acting Deputy President, evidence provided to a UK Parliament Transport Committee inquiry by the European Cockpit Association in 2012 stated, and I quote, "More importantly, fatigue is significantly underreported by the pilots themselves. This is because pilots do not file reports on an aspect that has become a so-called normal part of their daily work. Many are afraid their fatigue reports could have negative consequences for their professional future, i.e. reprisals by management, a phenomenon that is growing, particularly when pilots refuse to fly because they are too fatigued. Indeed, UK polling results show that 33% of pilots who would not feel comfortable refusing to fly if fatigued, and of those who would, 3/4 would have reservations. Once a pilot has decided they have no option but to fly, a fatigue report would be tantamount to writing the evidence for their own prosecution." I am informed, Mr Acting Deputy President, that the situation in Australia is very similar. It makes sense, therefore, that fatigue regulations should create a safety net that takes the decisions away from pilots and from their employers, and that fosters a culture where pushing through is no longer acceptable. My concerns relate to specific provisions in the regulations, including rest requirements in preparation for a flight, maximum flight duty periods, delayed reporting times, extensions of duty, standby times and augmented operations. These new regulations pay nothing more than lip service to the science behind the, quote, window of circadian low, and instead retain 5 a.m. as a start time for a flight duty period that does not incur additional rest requirements. The window of circadian low, or WOCL, refers to the time when most people have their deepest sleep and the body is most likely to need sleep. The most widely accepted scientific definition of this time is between 2 a.m. to 6 a.m, although CASA defines it as between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. Either way, duties starting at 5 a.m. have a significant impact on pilots' ability to sleep during this crucial period, because given that pilots obviously need to be awake on average 2 hours before their shift begins. This start time has been carried over from the previous regulations and has its origins in commercial imperatives. If pilots can start at 5 a.m. without penalties, then the high consumer demand for 6 a.m. flights can be more easily met. In practice, a pilot could be rostered to start at 5 a.m. 5 days a week, every week. This will obviously create a significant sleep debt in a very short amount of time and will have serious impacts on the pilot's ability to function.